Hi, Sandhya. How are you doing?
Hi, Karthik. I'm very well. How are you doing?
I'm not bad. Thank you for asking. You look absolutely radiant. I love what you're
Thank
wearing.
you. I thought it is spring, summer's coming, so why not channel that summer within myself? Yeah.
Absolutely. So you are indeed radiating it.
Thank
And
you.
I was mentioning just before you joined that we are immensely grateful for your time. I know that you've been keeping manically busy, and your time and effort is deeply appreciated at Driveway Devi.
Oh my God, Karthik, thank you. I heard the last bit of it when I joined, but I have to tell you that, and perhaps this can come up today as well, busyness can sometimes be a curse. I'd like to say very proudly that I'm a rehabilitated manic busy person. I schedule activities now rather than getting helplessly drawn into things, which was why I asked for permission to pace this out a little later than it could have possibly been, and that I might have said yes to even earlier. And that's done very consciously. And I really appreciate that you respected that.
Oh,
So I'm a
not at all.
rehabilitated manic. So
Well,
I hope I can
well,
convey
then,
that message.
then I would love it if the rehabilitated you, uh, sort of introduced yourself, and I'll tell you the reason I'm doing this. Amongst the average individual, there is still, particularly in India, you can speak to how it is in your neck of the woods, but there's still a lot of confusion surrounding the nomenclature of various mental health practitioners and professionals. Rather than me taking a stab at it and completely butchering it, I would love for you to share what you do in the professional mental health realm.
Sure. Um, I'm not sure if the question also included sort of telling me where I fit in into the
Most
ecosystem of
certainly.
mental health. Okay, so this is something that I'm often asked in my line of work. So I'm happy to share the way I describe it because it is a wide landscape, right? And very often a person seeking mental health help will not even know where to start. Okay, so in short, the short explanation is that if we consider, first of all, I'm not a big fan of labels, and I think many professionals in my line of work also are resisting a lot of the old labeling. And keep in mind that much of the constructs around psychology have been based on observed behavior, right? So whether it was Carl Jung, and or whether it was our feelings towards our parents or whatever, and all of that labeling, we didn't have anything more sophisticated than observation and interview at that time. In the last 35 years, but much more so in 20 and last 5, and perhaps by the minutes now, we now have far more sophisticated ways of understanding what actually goes on inside the brain and indeed all of the body, because what affects the brain definitely affects the body and vice versa, right? They're not separate. And that's one of the big shifts as well in mental health. And I cannot stress that enough. But getting more granular
No
than
pun intended. We should be careful of the word stress.
I know that's true, right? Double-edged sword. Actually, stress is a double-edged sword. Stress is not all bad, but that's another topic. Don't even get me started. But I was just going to say that my answer may not be as short as I may have begun it. So I will say that broadly, there is a baseline of how we're able to get by in our everyday life. Okay, so a lot of things that we might consider our quirks, or in the past like OCDs, we're very quick to label ourselves first of all, right, as something's wrong with us and that we are not like everybody else. The fact is that we're all looking out into the world from our own unique brains, and we somehow have been fed a template of what normal ought to look like, right? And we imagine that there is this bell curve of humanity, much of whom fall within this realm of, and to be fair, I mean, like I said, a lot of studies around this had to have created some kind of normalization, standardization in the past. The school system, for example, or the psychometric tests that we use before we hire people. What other tools do we have other than that I do this test, and if I fall on this range, then that puts me into this bracket. But I'm just saying that they are useful in their own place in the absence of other things, but they are not a substitute for us really understanding ourselves. Two, where required, we do have far more sophisticated ways of diagnosis, and I'm not for 1 minute dismissing what already exists. In the absence of anything else, we must rely on that which is more evidence-based than say self-diagnosis or I believe or that I am under the curse of a star, or their explanations, and I don't dismiss anybody else's explanation, but can that be validated? I will say that observational studies are far more credible for validation. So back to our baseline of functionality. If anything that is, so say I have what I would have labeled as like an OCD, or that I must check my windows twice every time before I leave my house. Now that must be giving me a modicum of safety that allows me to leave my house, that I will feel comfortable enough while I'm outside and not distracted by the thoughts of, will my house be burglarized? Now, where that came from, where it comes in the brain, nobody's ever done that diagnosis on me, right? But I'm still able to function. Perhaps it takes me 5 minutes longer. It's not me, I'm just extrapolating. It may take me 5 minutes longer or even 10 minutes longer to leave the house. So I'm still baseline functional. Now, if it's going to take me a whole hour, or if it prevents me from actually getting out of my house to do the things that I need to do, then we can say that this person is not able to function in the it's coming in the way of my everyday functionality. So that's when you fall below baseline functionality. And sometimes it's you that decides that. Sometimes it's the people around you that have to live with you, or that you are required to report into, like your workspace or your school. And there are different metrics, unfortunately, and we're not always very accepting and inclusive of divergence of needs and functionality levels. That's one of the biggest tragedies, I do believe, and is ripe for disruption. But that said, that's when you would typically go to a mental health expert, like a therapist, okay, a psychotherapist. They are able to diagnose mental health disorders, and even mental health disorders are on a continuum. Anything that takes us just below the baseline, that relates to like a particular incident, like I have a very big interview coming up and I'm feeling paralyzed almost with fear. I don't know where that's come from. To I've had a death in the family and that's put me in tremendous grief. So these are all around particular incidents, to I notice that I do have what I'm going to label for myself panic attacks or whatever, right? These are all two further down on the continuum, actual diseases which may not be long-term, and then there are chronic long-term diseases as well. So I always say that, look, if you've ever had a cold or a flu in your life, we definitely have also had a mental health disease in our life. I mean, how can it not be? It's all part of the same real estate, right? So would you rather then sit and say that, no, I you know what, I'm going to take antibiotics when I have tonsillitis, but if I have something that's wrong with my brain, I'm just going to pray that it goes away and not do anything about it? I mean, the choice is yours, of course, but that's the kind of suffering unnecessarily that we put ourselves into because of the kind of stigma that we associate with it. And as for the chronic illnesses, again, these aren't set in stone. I will say that much of the diagnosis, and you've probably talked about this in your line of work, comes from a great manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's on its fifth iteration, right? So DSM-5. Now, DSM-5 also happened several years ago, and there is a need. And I do believe there are some 200 neuroscientists, some of my friends are amongst them, that have actually written to the creators of DSM-5 saying that, look, time for really relabeling some of these and really looking at based on what we now know of how the brain works. So in fact, between 4 and 5, a lot of labeling, stereotyping, what we call disorders or diseases of the mind were sort of downgraded or based on our better understanding, right? Because at the end of the day, however scary that diagnosis may sound to us, let me tell you, for our brains, not knowing is far worse than getting bad news. Okay, so we know from behavioral science that even if, say, I were to have like an amputation of my arm, right, and my doctors told me that, safe to say that my baseline of happiness, if it were a 6 on 10, I would go to a -10 or something. Sure. But 6 months later, even without that one arm, I am back at a 6 on 10 again. but
Right.
not knowing if something will happen and not knowing what, how, what that could result in is much, much worse and creates far greater suffering. So I'm sorry I'm drawing that answer out quite long, but where I fit in really is slightly below the baseline, mental health. I don't do any kind of diagnosis work as a mental health coach, but very often, especially when I work in the corporate space, somebody that goes through the system will do some self-testing. They are run through several evidence-based WHO recognized tests, and it's a triaging system also based on their choices, right? That look, I've been feeling certain conditions, and when they tick certain boxes, again, observational, self-reporting, so I wouldn't call that 100% scientific, but it just tells them that, look, I think I would like to work with a coach now, or maybe suggested to them that, would you like to work with a coach, a mental health coach, or a therapist? Or a psychiatrist would typically fit in where there is a need for medication. Okay, so we are not able to. I mean, again, this is really the realm of what you talk about, so I don't want to belabor that. But a coach could work. Most coaches work above the baseline. Now I work a little below the baseline, but I also work very much above the baseline. So how do you get a person functional? And once you're functional, it can be a pretty daunting place to be in as well, right? Where do I go from here? Or the feeling that everyone else is so much further ahead. One of the biggest myths I've come across in my career, because let me tell you, people that appear to be at the top of their game, myself included, the nature of the brain is to always compare ourselves to somebody. Oh, but they're so much further, or they've got it so much easier, or why is my life so full of suffering? So that's the solace I hope to give anybody listening, that it's really about our own journeys, and that journey has certain qualities that we can incorporate into it that can make us truly thrive, and not thrive according to any other metric. With your permission, I'll just use a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, if that's all right. Okay. So whenever I use a quote from a religious text, I use it more metaphorically, not because of any particular belief system. I believe in everything and I don't believe in anything. Let's put it that way. So one of the lines from the Bhagavad Gita is that the only dharma that you have is to follow, I'm misquoting, but it is our obligation in this lifetime to follow our dharma. Following anybody else's dharma or living anybody else's dharma is adharmic, right? So in short, that ought to be
That
the
is
end of my talk. Thank you for your time.
that is the most detailed answer I have ever received, and ironic that you should quote a particular statement that is inadvertently proven or acted against, rather, on an everyday basis, again, at least in India, with a vast majority of families vis-a-vis their young children, and as they keep growing older, which is a very sad situation and something that resonates with me deeply, because that's the reason actually I teach, is to create an environment where students can find their dharma and the courage to then pursue it for the rest of their lives, irrespective. But yeah, lots and lots of thoughts are coming to my mind after that answer of yours, Sandhya. Let me go to, and of course, please, a quick caveat that I should have issued earlier. I'm going to ask perhaps rude, stupid, naive questions. So please tell me to bugger off or sort off and move on to the next one.
You
Now you talk.
me in my very long answer. How can I not respect the same?
Now, you mentioned, by way of example, somebody having to really sort of prepare mentally and psychologically, for example, in order to leave home to perform certain tasks. I've always wondered, is uh, agoraphobia a symptom or a condition?
Um, I am not qualified to give you the psychological answer of that, Karthik, and honestly, that is a question that is in the realm of psychology. I will say this, that a lot of so just to clarify for everybody, it is the fear of going outdoors, right? A lot of our fears come from a part of the brain called the amygdala. Okay, very often referred to as the lizard brain, or there's several other versions of it, okay, that you might hear, like the fight flight response in that sense. And we tend to believe that all this is hard coded in us, and it sounds logical that shouldn't fight flight be hard coded in us, in that it relates to survival. But some of, again, wonderful that you brought this up, because some of the newer work in neuroscience actually tells us that no, even our fight, do we have a strong survival instinct? 100% yes. All right. We might think that our brains are designed for doing all the critical thinking. You know, we're developing AI products. You're doing what you do. I'm coaching. But no, your brain, my brain, Einstein's brain is all actually hardwired. And by that, I mean, will prioritize at any point survival, conservation of energy, or efficient use of our energy, because that's a finite resource and very useful for survival to conserve that. Procreation, because we do want our species to continue and hopefully dominate. For some reason that we haven't found, there are some challenges to some of these ideas as well. But so how do we prioritize survival? Actually, is learned behavior. Okay, so what we talk about, the fight flight, yes, there is a structure in our brain called the amygdala. It is a very primitive structure in that, yes, it's also called the reptilian brain, right? So the lizard brain, reptilian brain. In that, do even reptiles, or what we call lower order animals, also have them? Yes, they do. All right. Now, we feel like a lizard has got just one response, that when they are faced with threat, they will either drop their tail or change color, and that's it. Right? But we humans are far more complex in how our amygdala, and again, once again, I'm not a neuroscientist. These are just my readings, and if anybody's interested, there's some interesting works by just so many neuroscientists that are working on this. You can literally just Google it and you'll find it. So what the amygdala does, first of all, the amygdala is not just about fight and flight. So we're often very scared of our fear. We are more fearful of our fear than the fear itself. Okay.
Absolutely.
But so two things. One is that the fear of the fear, and in Buddhism we call this the suffering around our fear, is very often greater than the fear itself. But secondly, and here's what I'm proposing, and based on what I have learned, is that the nature of this fear is learned, and that it's not hardwired in us. Is there some amount of anxiety that we do inherit genetically from our parents or from our ancestors, or indeed Lucy, the first Homo sapien? Yes, and it's really helped, us live up to 2023, when a branch of our cousins, stepped out of the cave and said, nothing's going to happen to us. It's going to be bright, sunshiny. That was the end of that line of Krishnans. But thankfully, thanks to my very sensitive amygdala, I've made it to 2023. So the amygdala, how I respond to fight, how I perceive danger, very likely learned in my early childhood. Okay, from one of my parents, one of my caregivers, we learn a lot of these ideas. All of our emotions really are concepts that we learn. We're born with very, very rudimentary emotions, or indeed even proclivities. All right. So if I had to go back to my introduction, when we talked about dharma, how do we, and what you do in terms of educate, the word educate means to draw out. All right. And how did we know what a child's dharma was? We watched a child at play, with very rudimentary play, and then we give them the environment, we teach them how to express themselves better. Okay. Sure. Similarly, we caregivers, we tribe of a new baby, in a sense, through our actions, less from our words and our lectures, are teaching a baby how to express themselves. So all of our emotions are your anger and my anger will look very different, Karthik. I mean, that's an obvious one to see, right? How is that possible? I'm able to recognize it as anger, but my display of anger will very likely be very different to yours, because of how we learned it in our childhood, or what position we took based on the other people around us in our childhood. So why am I banging on about this? If it's learned, it can be unlearned, or we can use what our anger or our sadness is telling us to channel us towards where we want to go today as an adult. We have a lot more agency. We have a lot more brain processing power today than we did as a child. And we can actually do things for ourselves as adults that we could not do when we were 4 or 5 or 2 when we learned these behaviors.
Yeah.
So
that makes a lot of sense. Now, Tell me, Sandhya, I want to combine two questions, and somehow, in fact, when I think about it now, it kind of surprises me how I didn't bring it up in our offline interactions. I want you to talk a little bit about when and what generation or part of your family moved away from India, moved abroad, and naturally one knows, and I think it's a safe assumption that people of Indian origin settling in a foreign country do experience several challenges, and mental and psychological struggles are very much part and parcel of that process. Now, so I want you to speak a little bit to that, and also, if at all, that informed your core decision of going into psychology, and how did that journey come about?
I think my mom is on this call, so I hope she doesn't get offended by any of this. But or maybe she should feel flattered. But she's not in India. So my grandparents went abroad. My father's family moved to Malaysia, as a lot of Malayalis did then. I'm from Kerala. My mother's family moved to, emigrated to Singapore. All right. Does that shift? And then when my parents came back to India to do their medicine, and I was born in India, in Trivandrum. But then we also went to Iran when I was quite young. So one is that in Iran, a lot of Indian doctors went there during the Iran-Iraq war, right? So did those images of violence, of war, of having to black out our windows, indeed of getting our house bombed, although I was not there at the time, do these play a part in who we are and how we are conditioned to see the world? 100% yes. So I will say this, that to just complete the answer on the agoraphobia, like do childhood incidents, could they play a role with some of these phobias? 100% yes. But it could also be a missignaling. A lot of what the stimuli hit a child's brain is processed very differently. Okay, so just to give you a simple example, a child watching a bombing on television, it could have a very real effect of clear and present danger for that child, and they're not able to actually visualize or comprehend that it's happening in a country that's 5,000 miles away, right? So and really the other part about the amygdala is that it's like a toggle switch. It's not like a fan with a regulator switch so much as it will just snap. And that's again very useful, because if there was a car careening towards you, if you wanted to put your regulator on, then I would be indeed that person with two legs less or whatever. But it was very useful for my amygdala to just snap so that I could throw myself out of harm's way. Now, so I will actually speak of my father's suffering, and then I'll tell you my suffering and how perhaps they may be connected. The other part about even something like agoraphobia is that we don't yet know exactly how what wires or misfires or what neurons fuse together in the brain that creates the story that outside my house is a very dangerous place. Right? That part we haven't reached that level of sophistication yet, even with the most advanced of fMRI techniques and other resonance imaging techniques that are available. So my father lived on a rubber plantation, and very often at night the rubber pods would, as they would dry, they would snap and pop with a loud noise that almost sounded like an explosion. Okay, so as a young boy in his room alone, and his mom may or may not have been around at the time, he started developing a lot of fear of noises. So till his dying day, my dad's no more, my father would never step out during Diwali. The smallest of sounds startles him, whether it's the backfire of a motorbike or, a slamming door or anything like that. Right. Now, two things happen. One is that I am his daughter. Okay, so guess what? I learned to become very sensitive to these noises as well. Now, which part of that anxiety could I have inherited genetically? We do know. And why do we inherit of all of the things, anxiety? Because that anxiety keeps us safe. That if you have learned that the world is a very dangerous place, what better gift can you give your children in that sense, right? And I'm aware that I'm sort of saying it almost sarcastically, but that let your child get that anxiety so that they can protect themselves. That's really the only survival role that anxiety plays. So to date, I have a very strong startle response myself. Now, did that come because I inherited it genetically from my father? Did that come because I learned that behavior from my father? Did that come because I was in a war situation myself as a child? We'll never really know.
Right.
At the
Makes
end of the
sense,
day,
yeah.
it's a narrative that we can create for ourselves. But as an adult, what I'm able to do is to actually change some of that narrative. I can bring it down from like a 10 of anxiety level to perhaps an 8, and then later a 6, and then maybe a 4. And there may be times when the same sort of noise that would once make me jump out of my skin, literally, today no longer even bothers me. Okay, but when I'm anxious about something else, or if I'm sleep deprived, if I've been dehydrated, my brain has already gone into a state of readiness, and the slightest of noise will take me back to that childhood pattern. Why?
Yeah.
It was very useful for my survival, right? So again, I hope that answers the question of
Yes,
how.
it does. It does very much. Now, I do want to know a little bit about the second part of my question, which is share a little bit about your own journey into the professional realm of psychology. You, I know, are clearly an underachiever because you can't, you seem to not be able to stop studying and advancing your knowledge. You're one of the most erudite coaches I've ever interacted with. But you're currently studying, and how did this whole thing come about? What were some of the factors, for example, that were determining sort of factors in terms of going into this academic and professional realm?
Okay. Um, so I'm done with my dad. Now, Mom, your turn. Again, with full disclosure, that this is just a narrative that I have created over time, right?
Sure.
Which is that both my parents are doctors, and I was always interested in science growing up, but I couldn't see where exactly I fit into. You just assume that you're going to be a doctor yourself, right? And of all of the areas, really the area that fascinated me the most was mental health, funnily enough. And I remember wanting to say to my parents that I would really like to be a psychiatrist, because that was really the only part of the world that I knew that dealt with the mind, right? And I will say that even amongst doctors of the time, there was a lot of stigma, and continues to be, by the way, stigma around mental health. And of course, we had all of the movies and I'm talking about the late 70s, early 80s, where people were people with mental health conditions. I'm not even going to use the word, but they're depicted as the kind of stereotypes that existed.
Absolutely.
And so I will say that with the best of intentions, that was discouraged. And then a whole bunch of things came in that unfortunately I can't blame my parents for. My own sort of sense of identity, where I fit in. And I think one of the enduring searches for me was, where do I fit in? But also that, who am I? And keep in mind that for many of us, and perhaps maybe slightly more so as stereotypes go for South Indian educated families, we all hide behind different identities, right? Of some hide behind the identity of our looks, behind our qualifications, behind our job, our designations, perhaps behind our wealth, or behind our Gucci belt. Okay, but they're all things that we're hiding behind one way or the other. And so for me, I somehow did not find any of these identities to really stick very or resonate with me. Somehow they felt like a hair shirt, a very uncomfortable jacket, and I would keep needing to shed it very quickly. So clearly there was something that was propelling me to find something. And I will say, if I'm a reformed manic busyness person, I'm also a reformed person of hiding behind labels, Karthik. My study today is not propelled, at least to the best of my knowledge, by a need to prove myself. So long story short, I did 100 different things, changed many, many different careers. And it was very consciously when I could take some time to slow down and really think about what it was that were my strengths, what were some of the repeating patterns in my life, what were my early childhood play and my proclivities like, right? What were the things that I would do when, there's a wonderful quote, I think by Lao Tzu, who said that, who were you before the world told you who you are? You know,
So
and it
beautiful.
was really going back to those years that helped me actually even find that there was something called coaching. And even within coaching, I keep myself so wide and open because I didn't want to restrict myself. I'm like, everything about us has got to get processed within this much of real estate. So can I just cut this much off and say that I'm a success coach, or this much and I'm a sleep coach, and without looking at the rest of what's going on? For me, I simply couldn't. I am a big picture pattern seeker. I like to spot trends or spot themes in my own life and in other people's life. So why not use that and stay true to that? Okay. So in a sense, it was with a lot of self-testing, rumination, speaking to peers, speaking to mentors. And then honestly, you had to get one thappad from somebody. So then why are you second guessing yourself? Just go and do it. And that's what it finally did take, because you're always second guessing, right? And of course, I mean, I couldn't let go of the feeling of, why should I be a kingmaker when I can be a king myself? And to which a wonderful coach from the US said to me that, you think that being leader means actually having a designation? Saying, imagine how much more powerful being a thought leader is, right? So it's not so much about, and that leadership also for me, I will say it's self-leadership, right? It's not about leading thousands behind you. Honestly, if you can gain mastery of this, your job is done in this lifetime, really, so that was one part of it. What happened was, and then to the busyness bit of it, I will say that I got lucky. And we know from behavioral science that you can do all of the studying, have all the contacts, have the best website, whatever. But it's like a game of snakes and ladders, honestly. Success, really, every once in a while you'll get a ladder and it can take you to a particular place on this map of life. Just as easily, 3 steps later, you can swallow a snake. I hope we know what snakes and ladders even is as a game. It's such an analog game now. But you can find a snake and you'll go right down. But such is life, that you take the highs with the lows. And I will say that I did get lucky. COVID for me was, before COVID, a lot of coaching was focused just on leadership and companies wanting to know what return they were getting on their investment. Come COVID, and suddenly things opened out. Of course, people were coming to me privately to say that, look, something doesn't feel right and I don't even know where to start. So I would be that person that people would come to if they didn't even know like what was wrong or where to start or what kind of help profession that they would need. In COVID, companies were just like, you know what, we don't want to lose our employees, or we see that people are not happy. We want them to be happy. We want them to be okay. Let them come to coaching for anything. And that's how we created this system of triaging, and whether they need to see a therapist, what kind of coach they would need to see. And so a large part of my success happens to be the accident of, the number of languages I could speak, the cultural backgrounds that I grew up in, the kind of work experience I may have had, although that's not actually what we do at all in coaching, but what I stood for and what I was offering as a service. And like I said, right place, right time, and the fact that I happen to be good with tech. Who knows what all happened in all of this, right? Now, what happened during COVID was that I was seeing so many clients, and indeed over the last 7 years or so, I've seen so many clients, and I couldn't help thinking that I'm working one-on-one, and I say this with just honesty. I cannot physically see more people than I'm seeing right now without it without burning myself out, right? Or I need to be able to restore myself so that I can be fully present for any of the activities. And also because I am rehabilitating myself, learning to prioritize rest, family, friends, and several other aspects of my life. And so I thought, how can I possibly create more impact? And in the line of Swadharma, look how everything's just tying in together, right? I thought to myself that, look, I have a background in radio, I've been on theater, I'm comfortable with stage, I'm comfortable with tech, I'm comfortable in front of a camera. I'm interested in research, I'm interested in the evidence of things. I also have a background in philosophy. How can I merge these two? Who can I serve more than I'm serving right now? Right? You get to that point where you realize that what I'm doing it seems to be helping, but I do feel empty. And again, I'll go to another Buddhist quote, which is that Buddhist saying, which is that he who bows and he who is bowed towards are both empty. So I really don't feel like I am doing anything amazing. I feel like this process works, and that this sweet spot of me being accessible to so many in so many countries, let me take that. What is my dharma? My obligation is to take this learning and do something with it more, right? Perhaps not just come into my area of comfort where I can keep doing this day in and day out. And for
Sure.
that is what I'm studying. I'm studying behavioral science and in public health. Okay, so my idea is, let me take the learning. I haven't figured out yet how the kind of work that I do one-on-one and how I'm able to spot patterns in one person's life, how I can extrapolate that to larger populations. But I'm like, I stand on the shoulders of giants. Why not see what behavioral science has already created in this space? And that's why my studies are currently on behavioral science and public health. So I can work with larger populations. It's a while. I'm only graduating in 2024, and that too if I pass all my papers. So.
So, speaking of coaching, and I'm going to use the word a little, I suppose, euphemistically, again, in the subcontinent, a lot of parents, conscious or unconscious, parenting mantra is coaching. And I want to ask you specifically, what has your own parenting journey been like with your children? And speak to some learnings, some challenges. Yeah.
Sure. Uh, I would like to clarify at the outset, Karthik, that the coaching that I think you are referring to is the kind of football coach that's standing on the sideline,
Yes, yes,
yelling at
yes,
kids, telling them
absolutely.
what to
I'm
do.
using it very
Right.
broadly.
In our line of work, we don't tell a client ever what to do, right?
Sure.
We truly believe that the client is in the driving seat and it's their journey, and it's our job to create insights. So I just want to clarify
Understood.
that that's the parenting style that we're talking about. For myself, I will say that this was one of the things that I did take very seriously, parenting. And in fact, and again, sometimes it's such a tragedy of the times, and perhaps less so now that technology and searching and thanks to ChatGPT, all of these things have, technology is truly an enabler, also a great democratizer of content and information. So I'm grateful for that, for the generations that have access to it. But when my children were born, the one thing I was very sure of was that I felt that neither was life an accident. I mean, like, were we all just supposed to like be born and then, like get buffeted about from here, there, whatever? Oh, I got into this college, so I'll do this. Oh, somebody offered me a job here, so I'm gonna run there. Now I don't like it, so I'll go somewhere else. And I was like, hold on a second, that doesn't feel right. There seem to be some people that seem to be thriving, but there are some people that seem to be on top of their game, but not necessarily happy. So it's again back to the pattern seeking. But they're nice to contemplate. But when I became a parent, I said, you know what, it's one thing for me to be having these wonderful intellectual thoughts but living my life completely on the hedonistic treadmill. I said, I owe it to my kids to not do this to them as well. And so, not knowing where to start, that's literally maybe a couple of weeks after my son was born is when I started studying Vedanta philosophy. Okay, so my boys are 20 and 18, so I can tell the minute somebody asked me how long I've been studying philosophy, it's like as old as my kids. I'm very clear about that. It helped me tremendously, but again, putting a lot of these into practice, I'll quote Einstein, who said that you can't solve a problem with the same brain that caused it. I will say I did it imperfectly, but I tried to raise them as consciously as I could. and I also now take myself a little bit off the hook, in that sometimes you can't prevent children from having the suffering that they have, right?
Sure.
It's their own journey. Partly they have learned it from you, and partly they have inherited, and you know who, and also it's the generation. We don't know all of the influences that come into a child's life. And
Right.
really, as a parent, the only thing that we can do is, one of the things that I feel parents are very quick to do is to take pain away from kids. And you know, like if a child falls down, the first thing we will do is run to them and say, "Oh, don't cry, don't cry. Here's a chocolate. Forget about the pain." You know, we don't teach our children that pain is just alerting us to what is salient to us and what is
Right.
important, and what our priorities are, or what we need to be taking care of. And so I will say, to that extent, I think both my boys, and keep in mind this is my narrative, you ask them, they have often threatened to go and report me and stuff like that, but I think that I have raised them as consciously as I could. I wish I'd had a bigger village around me, perhaps, you know, but it is the, you know, we all make our choices, and I did, I mean, to as much as was possible, to give them a wide range of influences. They have had their own mental health sufferings, especially during COVID. And again, I had a difficult time, but I leaned on my colleagues and my professionals in my line of work. So for my younger son, it was a lot easier, and they've given me permission to speak about this, so I'm saying it. You know, I had them both tested for ADHD. One seeing a therapist, one I couldn't find the right kind of mental health professional for them, so we went to a counselor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, back to a counselor. And sometimes, you know, the other thing is, we're very quick to dismiss something as not working for us, right? So I will say, why I'm bringing this out is that, just as you know, you might find that the first job you've taken is not your lifetime career, or the first orthopedician that you went to is not the one that suits you. The same with mental health experts. Don't be so quick to dismiss just the very first experience that you've had. And by the way, it's doubly difficult for mental health, because that first experience can often be the hardest one. Sometimes it gets better with the same professional, but also that if the first professional is not the right fit, and it's really unfortunate that we don't have enough of clarity around what each, our mental health professionals simply aren't trained to package themselves, talk about themselves well. I think it's so, part of the reason perhaps that I get the work that I do is that it's so easy to know what I sound like, what I look like, what I talk about, because it's everywhere, and I pretty much sound and look the same everywhere, you know. If there's one thing I would say to my fellow professionals is that, please talk more about the work that you do, you know, put yourself out there. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily on Instagram. I'm saying it's something as simple as, like, have a one-pager website, so that people can understand what they're getting into, where
Sure.
they can go, or even just, you know, facilitate the process of bringing somebody into the mental health, into the care system, and then helping them find their place. So for example, if I do a chemistry call with a person, a chemistry call is basically when we just meet somebody to, you know, to see if it's going to be a good fit. I always tell them that, look, you're under no obligation to work with me. Since I've given you this time, use this time to let us work together to help you find what the best path ahead for you is. You
Sure.
know, so that's me. My kids, they do have their struggles, but I will say that, I have to say that they are aware, they're compassionate. I think they both are truly looking for their paths. One believes they have found it, but who knows, you know, what other influences, what other parts of our vasanas, our intrinsic nature, may manifest. It's like a gene needs a particular environment to express itself. So too our vasanas, or our unmanifest desires, in different environments, will suddenly find that, oh my God, this actually feels so much more like me. But I support them in their decisions, and yeah, I think really it's about thriving. It's about them trying to find their happiness, and more than anything else, I like to think that they've been raised nimble enough so that they're not dependent on any worldly requirement, not too many worldly requirements, in which by which we almost like become like parasites. We become apahaj. We
Right.
become so helpless that we cannot live without these luxuries, so to speak. And I'll end with that. I have a wonderful mentor she's a therapist, and I'll quote her. Are we allowed to use language. Okay, I'll bleep myself out. Okay, she's such a wonderful person, and she says there is, which I took the greatest amount of solace from. Her one rule of parenting is that there is only one rule of parenting: you are going to it up. You can do
True,
everything,
true.
be as woke as be so involved, do this, whatever. And are we going to screw up? Yes. And once you accept that, then you take yourself off the hook, and you try and be far more present for what does this child need versus what's my own scorecard as a parent, and that shift can be very powerful, and you'll suddenly see your child for the first time, not look at the child through the eyes of what you believe a child ought to look like.
Would it be fair to make the generalization that Asian or South Asian students, children, are perhaps under a relatively greater scholastic and academic pressure than other community?
As broad stereotypes go, perhaps, Karthik, but again, I work very, very internationally in my line of work, and I'll say that scholastic is just one part of the pressure that we put on our children. I see people, I see, again, as stereotypes go, right? Like a lot of European parents put tremendous amount of pressure on their children on what their sporting life should look like, for example, or what their, something as simple, or again, these are just anecdotal. Anecdote does not make, and unfortunately, we don't have these statistics. There are studies that have studied them. For example, there was a very interesting study that came out in the US in, I'm going to say about maybe 10 years ago, that had already had the first generation of helicopter parents. And guess what? Helicopter parents came very likely from the US. So you have their own version of stresses and what a perfect child ought to be doing. I'll
Correct.
say that this is fairly universal of the human condition, which is that we want our children to somehow be better than us. And philosophically, actually, this goes down to a deeper idea of what we call the collective illusion. Okay, so every generation, like my parents' generation, for example, they knew physical scarcity, right? Like we couldn't afford a lot of things. Most of us could not afford a lot of things. But even if we did want to buy something like a scooter, for example, you have to wait for months. And there literally was, everything about life was a struggle. And so
Right.
while and I'm not talking literally about my parents here, while my
Sure.
parents may have wanted to, maybe just pursue their own interests, maybe do like something simple with us kids, like go on a picnic or whatever it might have been, they had to buy into their generation's narrative that we want the best for our children. Like we want, and what was the best at that time in the 80s was that our children must be well educated and our children must get secure jobs. Okay, so that was the collective illusion of that generation. Guess what? The collective illusion of one generation sort of becomes the internalized reality of the next. So we go through the school system thinking that I got to get the job of my, I got to get the best job. I got to be at the, because that's become the reality that we've been fed. And, and then in turn, now we have started buying into the collective generation, and I'm in my late 40s, right? So possibly the collective generation of the collective illusion of my generation is that we must all have like good jobs. We must have like a lot of luxuries. We must all go to Machu Picchu, and or Everest Base Camp. You'll be surprised how many 40-something-year-olds are doing it. Why? It's not because we're idiots, excuse my language. It's because we have bought into that these are the aspirational aspects. If I had to stop and ask myself, do I really want to go to Everest Base Camp? I'm like, not really. I don't think so at all. But that's how it operates, right? In a sense, these are cycles that get perpetuated. And I will say, Karthik, in my experience, whether it's been a radio jockey speaking to a taxi driver and a homemaker, and then the CEO of a company, that sort of, or me working with somebody from Lithuania 1 hour, and then Belgium the next, and then Gambia, and then Australia, in one day, I will say that there is a certain universality to the human experience. We are more alike than we are different.
Let me then conclude our interaction for today, because of course these kinds of discussions can go on and on rather endlessly. Perhaps we'll do a few more parts if you're willing. But I want to conclude today's interaction by asking you a slightly generic kind of question, but indulge me if you will. Um, what are some current triggers of general stress and anxiety that you have noticed nowadays?
Are we talking about the generation possibly just after us, like millennials and Gen Z? Is because keep in mind every generation has its
Has it?
own unique because of
Absolutely. No, that's a very valid point. So yeah, let's qualify that and say yes, the next generation
yes.
after us.
Yes, I would say that I mean, again, there's two parts. There's one is the universality of the human condition, which is the feeling of one of the, like I began this talk, funnily enough, was that it is the uncertainty of the future, right? Uncertainty of outcomes. I will say that the biggest malaise of our time is just uncertainty. And you can see it, right? If there's nothing, everybody's talking about, I mean, till last year, it was what is going to be the future of crypto. Now it's what is going to be the future of us, you know, with, 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 with artificial intelligence and generative AI and all of that. So I think it's the not knowing, but the short answer to that, and really not knowing on the one hand, but also the surfeit of information and data on the other. Okay, so we simply don't have time to process all of this, to digest some of this, and really know where we stand on things that are on things. Okay, that's the short answer. The I mean, that's the situation. The answer, I truly believe, will be, and I'm seeing young professionals do this. You know, I'm so blessed with the kind of people I work with. I feel like sometimes they come and find me because they want to fine tune what they've already begun, right? Which is why I say that I feel so empty in what I do, because I'm simply saying that here, I'm here for you, and let me help draw out, right? Which is that so many people are today restricting the kind of information. They're not flooding themselves. They're sitting with quiet in their head, so that so something as simple as, if you're afraid of, will I lose my job tomorrow, let us actually shine a light on that fear and see. And if for anybody that's a Harry Potter fan, much of our fears represent like dementors, which are these dark, wispy, scary creatures that, you know, seem to be looming over us. When we shine a torch on that fear, we can actually see the granularity of what that fear looks like. By the way, that's true of all emotion, right? When we actually look in, and a lot of the Buddhist ideas, Hindu ideas of sitting with our pain, sitting with our feelings, is really looking to see that they're actually just dots. It's like speckling of different metabolic arousal, right? So as adults, there's a lot that we can do. In a sentence, it is the prayer that's used in a lot of the 12-step programs, which is from the Second World War, which is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? It's very easy. And again, we don't do it because, you know, we're trying to self-sabotage. It's simply that nobody's taught us. It is so much more, it seems so much more important to our brain to sit and go circular and circular about all of our fears, when 1 hour of rumination that precious 1 hour could have been time in which we could sit and problem solve. So for example, I'm terrified of losing my job. I've always been, I mean, again, as stereotypes go, maybe being a good middle class South Indian girl, for me, job was so important, and I don't have a job right now. So one of the things I do to protect myself is that I do work with different kinds of coaching providers or professionals or companies on the one hand, so that I can, in a sense, I've defrayed some of my risks on the one hand. On the other hand, something that I really detested doing, which was to actually pay attention to my savings and grow my money. Because why? When you get a salary, it has to go into the bank and it has to go into an FD. That's how we were all raised. But I got Get Smart with Money, which is also, by the way, the name of a documentary on Netflix. I said, if I'm fearful of job loss, what is wrong with losing a job? It's that I shouldn't run out of money, right? Eventually. So you look at the heart of what the fear is, and let us actually do something about it today. And when that fear goes down, what it allows you to do then is, before this, in short, Karthik, I would not have been able to look at anything other than through the filter of this fear. Oh, it's not a steady job. It's not going to give me steady income. I don't even want it. Right? Now that I've done something about it and brought that fear down to a manageable level, now I'm standing on the cliff and I can see so much further, and I can equip myself with a glider, just to take that same metaphor forward, and now I can really take off. But I needed to have addressed that fear as well. And I can't just jump off blindly either, right? My brain will never let me do, because going back to what I began at first, my brain is not here to jump off a cliff. My brain is here to keep me alive. And that's the number one job of the brain.
It's, you are such a potent combination, if I may say, of a deeply philosophical standpoint. You clearly possess an amalgam of ethos from different streams of life and thinking, and you are extremely insightful and engaging to listen to. Thank you very, very much. It's been absolutely wonderful. I can listen to you for hours. You should have a podcast for sure, if you don't already. What do I say? Keep doing your dharma, because in doing that, you are changing many, many lives. And thank you for that.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you for this opportunity as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to everybody that was here and listening. Bye-bye.